Hello everyone, welcome to another What I Would Have Done Thursday, and today I'm going to be briefly exploring the animated film Titanic, The Legend Goes On, which is probably considered to be one of the worst animated films out there, and I think it's definitely safe to say why that is. I mean, obviously it does not add anything to the table as far as an animated film is concerned, and it doesn't provide the audience with any sense of really understanding the tragedy and the events that happened on the Titanic. And I thought it would be interesting to kind of explore this uh, film and what it does wrong and how I would have tried to fix it. I'll also try to explore the sequel that comes after this one and see what could be explored there. But I'm just starting from the beginning, being that there, being this as the being considering the fact that this is the first film, uh, which is I really, which is really strange to me why they would make a sequel to this, and I think they even make a third film of this too. So it's very bizarre, to say the least. But right out of the gate, I think the main issue that this film has, and I think what really diminishes its quality, is the presence of the animals. These animals do not add anything to the table, and if anything, they completely diminish the overall uh, understanding that anybody has of the Titanic. Um, and the fact that there is not only a rapping dog and Mexican mice, it only fuels the stupidity behind this film. So I think having these animals completely removed would have suited this film a whole lot better. And I think, again, I think it's trying to pander to children only because, again, they want to make it centered around trying to appeal to kids. But I think definitely here it's sort of inappropriate to really place these animals here because, again, they don't really serve all that much of a purpose. And if anything, they kind of really distract from the main focus of the Titanic and what really ultimately goes on and what's really sort of the climate or at least the environment during the time period. So, again, having these animals completely discarded, I think, would have suited this whole film a lot better. Also, there is a lot of copying from not only animated films, but also from the live action version of Titanic. So I think that whole dynamic definitely needed to be altered. I think instead that what they could have done is they could have just had, um, instead of two sort of star-crossed lovers, have the main characters be a poor family who's trying to get a better life in the United States. And you could sort of address the kinds of struggles that they face and how there is this sense of elitism among the upper classes within the Titanic, because that was really mainly the big dividing factor with people back then, more so than anything else. So I think had they focused in on that aspect, it would have suited itself a whole lot better and would have given out something that was at least a little bit more new and not as not as a not trying to appeal to uh, basing things off of other material. So I think that could have been something useful. And um, also, again, and this has to do with sort of the animals being inserted in there, is that they try to make it uh, seem like that this whole uh, tragedy of the Titanic is not as bad as it was. I mean, they kind of really sugarcoat the whole history really with this film, and almost to the point of, again, sort of insult. Um, Being someone that is really passionate about history and really cares about the circumstances during the time periods of different eras. I mean, this was just so poorly thought out in trying to address the whole tragedy of Titanic. And a lot of that had to do with not only the animals being present, but trying to give off this feel goody kind of nature that really, again, is, it's done to the point where they are kind of ignoring the reality behind this sort of event. And again, I'm not saying that they couldn't have made this appeal towards children. And again, I think that you can make films that are sort of centered on more serious things and still make it for kids. Um, but see, this is the difference between an animated film like this and an animated film like, for example, Pinocchio. Pinocchio actually has real horror and it has real kind of tragedy to it as well. So it adds a whole lot more uh, to those moments of real tragedy and sadness. And when the good stuff happens, you feel all the more better and think that the uh, struggles and turmoils were uh, were overcome. And here you really don't get a sense of really people struggling all too much, except the dude who has to try to survive being on some kind of box in the ocean. I mean, and that's really beyond anything else, because again, they don't really treat this as a very serious tragedy. And I think that's a problem. And unlike other animated films that do treat their circumstances with a sense of tragedy, this one really, really tries to hide it as much as they can. I mean, if you were to look at the whole essence of what this film is about, you wouldn't even think Titanic would have even been brought up, especially when there's supposed to be rapping dogs, Mexican mice, uh, and all of these other things that are again more so associated with a children's cartoon show rather than anything that is supposed to be of any form of a animated film. So I think uh, that's really ultimately the main problems with this film. I mean, pretty much it's almost like you would have to rewrite everything, and also the animation quality is very poor. And especially when you're addressing a tragedy like this, and how intricate and artistic the Titanic was, because it was supposed to be a uh, very magnificent feat of engineering at the time. So to completely kind of phone that in as well really does show. And I mean, I think that had there been more emphasis on that as well, there would have been a lot more of a sense of artistry. And again, these are really, though, the big problems. I mean, they really take up the majority of the film, or at least the whole of it. And had all of these things been altered, I think they could have taken a more a children's interpretation of the story, without tampering or diminishing the uh, essence of the history behind it. And again, regardless of what you have to say about the live action version of Titanic, at least there was a certain aspects to it that were trying to take that piece of history seriously. From the detailing of the ship to the whole tragedy in and of itself and how that's executed. And again, the characters do have development to them. They're just not as fleshed out as maybe some other characters, or as much as some other films that at least were coming out during the time, I thought were. But again, it took itself seriously and it gave off an overall, I think, good impression, even though, again, I think it is a little bit overrated. But here it takes everything that you would not really want to use to make an animated film about Titanic. You know, it takes all of the bad things that not only we associate with um, when it comes to poorly executed animation, but also just the story within it of itself and the way they approach it just really lacks any real depth or anything really interesting or profound or emotional. You know, it just nothing, and that there's nothing there. So, uh, but again, I think had they've taken this a little bit more with a more adult approach, but still keeping it open to children. Maybe having the main characters be sort of the children within the family and sort of seeing their kind of life story of being a kid, sort of, and having to deal with the fact that they're not of a higher class compared to some other people, or, you know, things of that nature would have been a lot more of an interesting uh, would have allowed for a lot more of an interesting take. But I think that's really all I can say about this particular film. But if there are any questions, comments, concerns, I'd be more than happy to answer them. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year, and I hope to see you all in the next video.